There is a specific, sickening sound that fiberglass makes when it snaps under pressure, a dry, hollow crunch that vibrates right through your bones, and I was forced to listen to it on a loop as I stood ankle-deep in the freezing surf of Anchor's Rest, watching my life's work disintegrate into driftwood. Brenda Sterling, the self-appointed queen of our local Gilded Shore Association, stood on her manicured balcony sipping a Chardonnay, watching a demolition crew tear apart my 40-foot catch, the Horizon. I spent 3 agonized years restoring that boat, sanding down every inch of teak until my fingerprints were gone, replacing the rigging wire by wire, breathing life back into her hull, because she was the only thing that kept me breathing after my wife, Sarah, passed away. To Brenda, however, my therapy, my sanctuary, my second chance at a life worth living was nothing more than an unauthorized visual nuisance that threatened her precious property values, so she ordered it turned into scrap. Feeling better now, Lucas? Her voice drifted down from the cliffside, dripping with that fopolite poison she had perfected over a decade of terrorizing this coastline. And I turned to face her with debris floating between us, pieces of my heart bobbing in the tide. "I'm doing just fine, Brenda. Thanks for asking," I replied, my voice dangerously calm, which clearly confused her because she was expecting a scream, a breakdown, or a beg for mercy, but she didn't know about the dusty, yellowed file I had found in Grandpa Arthur's attic 3 weeks prior. Let me rewind the tape, because to understand why I was smiling while my boat sank, you have to understand the chess game I'd been playing in the dark. 3 weeks before the demolition, I was sorting through the chaotic estate papers left behind by Grandpa Arthur, a man who smelled perpetually of pipe tobacco and salt spray, when I stumbled across a thick, leather-bound portfolio labeled Vance Maritime Holdings, dated 1962. Inside were incorporation documents, rusted paper clips holding together stock certificates, and a handwritten note that made my hands tremble as I read it in the dim light of his study. "Lucas, if you're reading this, some suburban tyrant is probably trying to tell you where you can and can't park your boat, so you should probably know that you own the water they're looking at." I froze, the silence of the room amplifying the thud of my heart, as I flipped through the surveyor maps and realized that Vance Maritime Holdings held the deed to 67% of the harbor, including the submerged land extending 200 feet out from the shoreline of every single waterfront mansion in Anchor's Rest, including Brenda Sterling's sprawling estate. For 3 years, Brenda and her Gilded Shore Association had been slapping fines on fishermen, evicting tenants, and acting like feudal lords of the ocean, but it turned out she was just playing dress-up in a kingdom that actually belonged to me. The smart move would have been to run to her door waving the papers immediately, but I knew Brenda. I knew that if I showed my hand too early, she would just slink away, resign from the board, and move to Florida to terrorize retirees, and I wanted something more permanent than a resignation. I decided to let her escalate, to let her dig a hole so deep and so criminal that she would never see the sun again. So I started a journal, documenting every threat, every illegal fine, and every abuse of power she levied against the working-class boat owners of the Marina. The harassment ramped up 3 days later when Brenda sent her nephew, Kyle, to perform a mandatory structural assessment of my boat. Kyle was a 20-something with zero marine experience who showed up wearing actual metal-spiked golf cleats, and I sat there in silent, seething agony as he stomped across my freshly varnished deck, the metal spikes gouging deep scratches into the wood I had just spent a month restoring. He looked at my rigging, tangled himself in a halyard like a confused puppet, and then declared, "Brenda says it's structurally unsound and aesthetically incompatible with the neighborhood vibe," while Brenda beamed from the dock like he had just discovered gravity. 2 days later, the violation notice arrived. Fines of $500 a day until the hazard was removed. I didn't fight it. I didn't argue. I just quietly drove to the county courthouse and the state maritime archive, verifying every inch of Grandpa Arthur's claim, confirming that HOA bylaws have absolutely zero jurisdiction over navigable waterways, and that Brenda was essentially practicing maritime law without a license. The tension in the town was palpable, a thick fog of resentment hanging over the harbor because Brenda wasn't just targeting me. She was going after Old Man Miller, a lobster fisherman whose family had worked these waters since the Great Depression. She called his traps visual pollution and tried to force him to paint his buoys beige to match the HOA color palette, a level of insanity that would be funny if it wasn't destroying people's livelihoods. I started discreetly gathering allies, drinking coffee with the Coast Guard mechanics and the local environmental officers, planting seeds, asking hypothetical questions about jurisdiction, and learning that Brenda had burned bridges with every agency in the state. Then came the phone call that changed the texture of the war. Inspector Davis from the state tax assessor's office called me, confused, asking why Brenda had been claiming tax exemptions for water rights she didn't own, and simultaneously, why she had built a massive, multi-story boat lift without a single environmental permit. I realized then that she wasn't just a bully. She was a criminal, operating completely off the grid while demanding strict compliance from everyone else. I walked the shoreline with a telephoto lens, documenting her illegal runoff pipes dumping landscaping chemicals directly into the protected shellfish beds, documenting the unpermitted dredging she had done to accommodate her husband, Richard Sterling's massive yacht, and I handed it all over to Inspector Davis, who looked at the photos like a kid on Christmas morning. But Brenda, sensing she was losing control of the narrative, decided to go nuclear. She called an emergency town hall meeting to discuss the crisis of substandard vessels, creating a slideshow that compared my classic restoration to abandoned junky boats, whipping the wealthy newcomers into a frenzy about property values. Old Man Miller stood up, his weathered hands shaking, and told the room that my boat was the most beautiful thing in the harbor, but Brenda cut him off, sneering that we aren't discussing the opinions of the working class, we are discussing equity, a statement so vile it caused half the room to walk out. I knew then that she was desperate, and desperate people do stupid things. I left town for the weekend, a calculated move to give her the opening she was looking for, and sure enough, while I was visiting my sister, I got the call from Miller. "Lucas, you need to come home," he choked out, the sound of heavy machinery roaring in the background of the call. "She's doing it. She's actually doing it." The drive back was a blur of white knuckles and adrenaline, but by the time I pulled into my driveway, it was over. The crusher claw of the demolition barge was retracting, and the horizon, my connection to Sarah, my labor of love, was reduced to a debris field of floating timber and oil. Brenda stood there, triumphant, having no idea she had just handed me the final piece of evidence I needed to bury her. The smell of diesel fuel and raw sewage hung heavy over Anchor's Rest, a toxic perfume that marked the grave of my boat. I walked past the police line tape, ignoring the sympathetic glances from the deputies who knew exactly what a travesty this was, and stopped at the edge of the dock where Old Man Miller was using a pool skimmer to retrieve pieces of my mahogany trim. "Lucas, I tried to stop them," he said, his voice cracking. "I stood in front of the truck, but they threatened to have me arrested for trespassing." "It's okay, Miller," I said, placing a hand on his shoulder, feeling a cold, crystalline calm settle over me like a blanket of snow. She just made the biggest mistake of her life. I pulled out my phone and began photographing everything. The license plates of the unpermitted demolition crew, the oil slicks spreading toward the nature preserve, and most importantly, Brenda Sterling toasting her victory with her husband Richard on their deck. She saw me taking pictures and actually waved, shouting, "It was an emergency safety intervention, Lucas. The HOA has broad powers in emergency situations. We'll see about that," I muttered, pocketing the phone. While I was outwardly playing the role of the defeated victim, filing police reports for destruction of property, the gears of my trap were slamming into place. The demolition company, when pressed by the police, admitted they never pulled a marine permit because Brenda assured them the HOA had jurisdiction, meaning she had personally authorized a felony destruction of property. But the real heavy artillery was coming from the environmental agencies. Because Brenda had disturbed the harbor bed to destroy my boat, she had inadvertently triggered a mandatory EPA inspection of the immediate area. Inspector Davis arrived the next morning with a team of federal agents, and because they were already there investigating the debris field, they happened to notice Brenda's illegal boat lift and the toxic runoff pipes I had tipped them off about weeks ago. I watched from my living room window as Inspector Davis handed Brenda a clipboard with a cease and desist order. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw Brenda's face go from smug to pale to a shade of furious red that matched her lipstick. She was looking at fines in the tens of thousands, but she still thought this was just a bureaucratic annoyance. She had no idea the ground beneath her feet was about to disappear entirely. I waited 3 days, letting the rumors swirl, letting her think she could lawyer her way out of the environmental fines, and then I played my ace. I posted flyers for an emergency waterfront authority meeting at the community center, promising to clarify all jurisdictional disputes. Brenda arrived 20 minutes late, flanking herself with Richard and her high-priced legal team, striding to the front row with the confidence of a woman who believes money is a shield against reality. "Thank you all for coming," I began, gripping the podium to hide the shaking of my hands. Not from fear, but from the sheer adrenaline of the kill. "We are here to clear up a misunderstanding regarding who actually controls the waterfront of Anchor's Rest." Brenda scoffed loud enough for the back of the room to hear. "The HOA controls the waterfront, Lucas. Get over it. Your boat is gone." "Actually, Brenda," I said, my voice dropping an octave, "that's where you're wrong." I opened Grandpa Arthur's portfolio and projected the digital scans of the 1962 incorporation papers onto the screen behind me. "Ladies and gentlemen, meet the majority shareholder of Vance Maritime Holdings. According to these state-verified documents, which have never been dissolved, I own the submerged land, the docking rights, and the commercial access for this entire harbor." The room went so silent you could hear the hum of the vending machine in the hallway. "That means," I continued, locking eyes with her, "that every single dock, including yours, Brenda, is an encroachment on my corporate property. You aren't owners of the water, you are tenants. And you haven't paid your rent in 40 years. Brenda stood up, her chair screeching against the floor. "This is absurd. This is a fraud. It is a matter of public record," I countered, pulling out a spreadsheet. "And since you've been acting as a landlord without ownership, let's talk about liabilities. Mrs. Sterling, your property currently owes Vance Maritime Holdings approximately $31,000 in back lease fees. Furthermore, you just utilized a commercial demolition crew to destroy a vessel docked legally in a slip that I own, which constitutes grand larceny and destruction of corporate assets." Richard Sterling looked like he was having a cardiac event. He started whispering frantically to their lawyer, who was flipping through the photocopies I had distributed with a look of pure horror on his face. The lawyer knew. He knew instantly that they were cooked. "I am officially reactivating the corporation," I announced to the stunned crowd. "I am invalidating all HOA authority over the water immediately. If you have a boat, you deal with me. And unlike Brenda, I don't care about the color of your buoys. I care about maritime law." The room erupted. The fishermen, the working-class families, the people Brenda had bullied for years started cheering. Brenda, realizing she was losing the room, tried to storm the stage. "You can't do this. This is America. I have rights. You had rights," I said, leaning into the microphone. "Now, you have a federal investigation. Because I also handed over the recordings of you soliciting bribes to the harbor master to the FBI this morning." That was the twist she didn't see coming. In her desperation to cover up the environmental violations from earlier in the week, she had offered Commissioner Stone, a man she thought was corrupt but was actually working with the state anti-corruption task force, 10 grand to lose the paperwork on her illegal dock. The look on her face wasn't just fear anymore. It was the hollow, shattering realization that her life as she knew it was over. She grabbed Richard's arm and fled the hall, but the flashbulbs of the local press followed her all the way to her Mercedes. The end of Brenda Sterling's reign didn't happen in a courtroom, but at the annual Harbor Festival, a poetic stage for her final collapse. Despite the looming indictments, Brenda was possessed by a delusional defiance, convinced that if she just showed her face and acted like the victim, the community would rally to protect her status. She showed up to the festival in a white dress, trying to cut the ribbon on the new pier as if she hadn't been fired from every committee in town. I was standing on the boardwalk with Dr. Elena Rossetti, the marine biologist who had helped me map the environmental damage when the chaos started. Brenda had ordered her illegal boat lift to be hastily dismantled by a shady crew to hide the evidence before the EPA returned, but in their haste, they destabilized the main support beams. As Brenda marched toward the podium to hijack the microphone, a thunderous crack echoed across the bay. We all turned to see her massive, unauthorized boat lift, the symbol of her excess, shearing away from the cliffside. The heavy steel structure groaned and then plummeted into the water, taking her husband's prized luxury yacht, the Sterling Standard, down with it. The splash was biblical. A wave of oily, murky water surged up, drenching Brenda from head to toe in the consequences of her own corner cutting. She stood there, dripping wet, her white dress ruined by harbor sludge, staring at the bubbling spot where her fortune had just sunk. "My boat," she shrieked. "He did this. Lucas did this." But nobody was listening to her accusations. Inspector Davis stepped out from the crowd, followed by 2 uniformed officers. They didn't even have to chase her. They simply walked up to the sodden, shivering woman and placed her in handcuffs right there in front of the funnel cake stand. The charge wasn't just the destruction of my boat or the bribery. It was now catastrophic environmental negligence for the fuel spill caused by her collapsing, illegal structure. Richard Sterling watched from the parking lot, shook his head, got into his car, and drove away, leaving his wife to face the music alone. It was the coldest, most final goodbye I'd ever seen. 6 months later, the atmosphere in Anchor's Rest is unrecognizable. Brenda is currently serving a sentence in federal prison for fraud and environmental crimes. Richard was forced to liquidate their assets to pay the massive fines and the settlement to me for the horizon. Their mansion was sold at auction and, in a twist of irony that tastes sweeter than honey, was purchased by the Miller family. The very fisherman she tried to run out of town now drinks his morning coffee on her balcony. As for me, I didn't buy a new yacht. I used the settlement money and the back rent fees from the Marina Corporation to establish the Sarah Vance Maritime Scholarship, a program that teaches local kids how to sail and repair boats, keeping the heritage of this town alive. I stand on the docks now, watching the kids learn to tie knots, hearing the laughter that was missing from this place for so long. I'm rebuilding a new boat, a smaller one, with Elena. We're taking it slow, sanding the wood together, doing it right. Brenda wanted to destroy my boat to save the neighborhood, but in doing so, she saved the neighborhood from herself. It leaves you with a question that keeps me up at night, though. Is it truly justice when you have to lose the thing you love most to get it? I lost the horizon, but I gained a community. Maybe that's the trade-off. Maybe the old wood had to rot away, so something stronger could be built in its place. All I know is, the water is calm today, and for the first time in years, it belongs to everyone. What would you have done? Would you have taken the money and moved? Or would you have burned it all down to prove a point? Let me know in the comments. This is Lucas Vance, signing off from Anchor's Rest.